The sun was a hammer, and the anvil was the whole damn world. It beat down on the cracked earth, turning it to a field of bones. Poker Alice felt it on her skin, through the thin cotton of her dress, a dry, scorching heat that stole the air from your lungs. The water pail was heavy, digging into her hip, but the weight was a comfort. It was the only thing of value for 100 miles in any direction. The spring was almost gone, just a muddy seep at the bottom of a rock bed. She'd known it would be, but hope is a mean little devil that whispers in your ear when you're thirsty. So she'd walked. Now, halfway back to the squat little cabin that was more a pile of stubbornness than a home, she saw it. At first, she thought it was a coyote, crippled and dragging itself to a shady place to die. A low, dark shape against the blinding glare of the dirt. But as she got closer, the shape resolved. It was a man, face down, unmoving, his clothes little more than bloody rags. An arrow shaft, snapped in two, stuck out of his thigh like a broken branch. Poker Alice froze. Every muscle in her body screamed to turn and run. He was Navajo. The word itself was a warning bell, rung loud and clear by her father's ghost. You see one out here alone, Alice. He's the bait. The rest are in the rocks, watching, waiting for a fool to walk into the trap. Her father had been a hard man, but he hadn't been stupid. She should have listened. She should have turned her back, walked away, and forgotten the shape in the dust. But her feet, clumsy and raw from the walk, took another step forward. Then another. The smell hit her first. Hot blood, sweat, and the sour tang of something giving up. His skin was dark, his hair matted with grime and red dust. His chest rose, but it was a shallow, faltering thing. A flutter, not a breath. This man wasn't a threat. He wasn't bait. He was just meat for the buzzards. Her hands trembled as she knelt beside him. The heat radiating off his body was like a furnace. You got no right being here, she whispered, the words swallowed by the vast, empty silence. It was a stupid thing to say. The land didn't belong to her. It didn't belong to anyone but the heat and the wind. She dipped her fingers in the precious water she'd carried all this way and let a few drops fall on his cracked lips. He flinched. A groan rumbled in his chest, a sound so broken it made her own throat ache. His eyelids fluttered, but they didn't open. He was close, too close. Don't you dare die on me, she muttered, pulling the scarf from her own neck. She tore a strip, her hands clumsy, and pressed it against the gash on his side. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Above, a shadow passed over the sun, a single buzzard, circling in a slow, patient spiral. It knew what she knew. Death was coming, and it was hungry. She had minutes, maybe less. Lord help me, she gritted out between her teeth. I'm gonna regret this. Dragging him was a nightmare. His dead weight was an anchor, pulling her down into the dust. Her legs screamed, her lungs burned, but she kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. She got him to the thin shade of some scrub brush and collapsed, her chest heaving. The cabin was still a mile away, an impossible distance. He stirred, his voice a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. Water, he croaked. Already gave you some, she snapped, her fear turning to anger. Anger at him, at herself, at the whole damn world. But she tipped the pail anyway, letting him sip the last of the warm, gritty water from her cupped hand. He mumbled something then, a word she didn't know. It wasn't a curse. It sounded almost like a name. Another shadow passed overhead. She looked up, her heart a cold stone in her gut. It was just a hawk this time, but the message was the same. The weak don't last long out here. She made the decision without thinking, a raw instinct taking over. She braced herself, hauled him upright, and started walking again. Each step was a fresh wave of fire in her muscles. The cabin finally came into view, a shimmer of heat on the horizon. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin, tired ribbon against the endless blue. Her home, her fortress. She kicked the door open, dragged him inside, and pulled open the trapdoor to the root cellar. The cool, earthy darkness below was the only safe place she could think of. He moaned as she lowered him down, his body thudding onto the dirt floor. She threw a dusty quilt over him, then slammed the trapdoor shut. The sound echoed in the small room. Only then did she let herself fall against the wall, gasping for air, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. The sun was dipping low, painting the world in shades of orange and blood. Poker Alice loaded the old rifle her father had left her. She sat by the window, peering out into the twilight, her nerves stretched as tight as a wire. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every creak of the old cabin sounded like a door being forced. "You better live, Navajo," she whispered into the growing dark. "Because if you die down there, I swear I'll follow you to the other side just to haunt you." She must have drifted off, her head slumped against the window frame. But it wasn't a gentle sleep. It was a dark, heavy thing that was shattered by a sound. A low, rumbling vibration that came up through the floorboards, humming in her teeth. Her eyes snapped open. Her heart lurched into her throat. Through a crack in the door, she saw them. They emerged from the dust of the pre-dawn light like ghosts. Horsemen, a dozen of them. Feathers in their hair, rifles held easy in their arms. They didn't shout. They didn't charge. They just appeared. They formed a slow, deliberate circle around her cabin, their silence more terrifying than any war cry. The message was clear. They knew, and they had come for what was theirs. Poker Alice stood up, her legs shaking so hard she thought they'd give out. She could bolt the door, fire a few shots, maybe take one or two of them with her before they burned her out. Or she could open the door. She could walk out there and face them. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You did this, Alice. You gave water to a dying man, and now death has come knocking on your door." She took a deep, shuddering breath. A figure dismounted from the lead horse, taller than the rest, his face painted in stark, sharp lines. He just stood there, waiting. She felt the weight of his stare through the wood of the cabin door. This was it. The gamble she'd made when she touched her water to the stranger's lips. And now, the dealer was calling her bluff. She reached for the handle, the cold iron a shock against her skin. Then she opened the door. The rising sun at her back threw her silhouette across the porch, turning her into a long, wavering shadow. The rifle felt heavy in her hands, but she kept the barrel pointed at the ground. There was no sense starting a fight she couldn't possibly win. The leader's eyes, black and unreadable, as polished river stones, watched her every move. "I ain't looking for trouble," she said, her voice rough with dust and fear. "But if trouble's what you brought, you best know I'll stand my ground." The warrior didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply raised one hand, palm out. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a peace sign either. It was just a statement. He was here. He wasn't leaving. Then, from beneath her feet, came the sound that damned her. A faint groan from the man in the cellar. Every single head in that circle of riders snapped toward the cabin. Their eyes bored into her, a dozen pairs of black daggers. Alice gritted her teeth. No use hiding it now. "You want him?" she called out, taking a defiant step forward. "Then you'll listen first. He was dying when I found him. Food for the vultures. I pulled that arrow out myself." Silence. The air was thick with it, heavy with unspoken judgment. She felt like an insect pinned to a board. She squared her shoulders, forcing the tremor from her hands. "I'll hand him over," she said, her voice rising. "But not till I know he's not going to die the second I do." I didn't save him just to watch you finish the job." The leader's eyes narrowed. A low murmur rippled through the other warriors, like the sound of a snake sliding through dry grass. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, the leader gave a single, sharp nod. Poker Alice let out a breath she didn't even know she was holding. But the knot of fear in her gut didn't loosen, not one bit. Because out here, mercy was just another word for a trap, and she had just walked right into it. The lead warrior dismounted, his movements slow, deliberate, each one weighted with authority. He was taller than he looked on horseback, lean and hard as the land itself. Across his chest hung a necklace of polished bone that clicked softly as he walked toward her. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his presence a physical force, pressing in on her. "Brother," he said. The word was rough, clipped, not a question, a claim. Alice tightened her grip on the rifle. "I found him half dead," she repeated, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "He's alive. That's all that matters." The leader's gaze flickered from her face, down to the rifle, then back up. He seemed to be weighing her, piece by piece. Then he held up his hand again, this time to his men, a clear signal to hold. Another warrior, older, with a face like a road map of hard miles, rode forward and spoke to him in their own tongue, the words flowing like water over rocks. The leader listened, then turned his full attention back to Alice. "You are a good woman," he said, the English words tasting strange in his mouth. "But he is ours. Will you take care of him?" The question slipped out, weaker than she wanted. The leader's expression didn't change. "He is blood," he said, and the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. Blood does not leave blood behind. It was the same fierce, stubborn pride her own father used to have. It was then that she saw it. Over the shoulders of the warriors, far down the trail, another cloud of dust was rising, and this one was different. It was the frantic, churning dust of men riding hard and fast. Settlers, from the town, at least 6 of them, sunlight glinting off the rifle barrels slung across their saddles. Her stomach plummeted. They must have seen the Navajo riders from a distance, and they wouldn't be coming to talk. She spun back to the leader. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and urgent. She took a step closer, and the warriors behind him shifted, their hands going to their knives. He held up his hand again, stopping them. "You've got trouble coming. Those men, they shoot first. They don't ask questions." The leader's jaw tightened. His hand dropped to the handle of the tomahawk at his belt. In that split second, Poker Alice did the craziest, most reckless thing she had ever done in her life. She shoved her rifle into his hands. He took it automatically, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and confusion. "You'll need it more than I will," she said, her voice shaking. "But maybe we don't have to fight." The rumble of hooves was getting louder. They were close. A shout carried on the wind. "Indians! At the Boone place! Get ready, boys!" It was Barton Clay's voice, a man who hated anything he couldn't own or kill. She turned back to the Navajo leader, her heart pounding against her ribs. "You want to live?" she snapped. "Then we fight together, or we all die right here." For a moment that stretched into an eternity, no one moved. The air was electric. Then, a slow, grim smile spread across the leader's face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a wolf that sees another wolf. He handed the rifle back to her. "You fight good," he said simply. Poker Alice worked the lever, chambering around. "I sure as hell hope so." The Navajo warriors moved like smoke. One moment they were a circle of mounted men in the open. The next, they had vanished. They melted into the landscape, using the sparse rocks and shallow dips in the land for cover, with a speed and silence that was unnerving. Alice didn't wait. She scrambled to the side of her cabin, dropping to one knee behind a stack of firewood, the rough wood digging into her back. The settlers thundered in, pulling their horses up short in a chaotic swirl of dust and panicked whinnies. Barton Clay, his face red and bloated with rage, leveled a shotgun in her direction. "Boone, get inside, you crazy woman. We'll handle this scum." Alice rose slowly, keeping the rifle pointed down but ready. "They're not here to fight, Clay," she shouted over the stamping of the horses. "Let them take their man and go." The settlers laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "You've gone soft, Alice," one of them sneered. "They'll scalp you the second your back is turned." A shot rang out. A puff of dust kicked up at her feet. Clay's warning. "Move aside, woman," he barked. "This ain't no place for an Indian lover." But before he could fire again, another shot cracked through the morning air. It came from the rocks behind her. Not at the settlers, but into the sky. A clear, sharp report that echoed across the flatlands. The Navajo were making their presence known. All around the settlers, the sun glinted off rifle barrels appearing from behind boulders and brush. They were outnumbered, and they were surrounded. "Don't be a fool, Clay," Alice screamed. "You start this. None of us see tomorrow." But panic is a faster draw than reason. A young settler, barely a boy, with wide, terrified eyes, jerked his rifle up. "Hold your fire!" Clay roared. It was too late. The boy squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was the spark that lit the powder keg. The world exploded. Gunfire roared from all sides, a deafening thunder that shook the ground. Horses screamed, rearing and bolting. Dust and gun smoke boiled up, creating a thick, choking fog. Alice threw herself to the ground, rolling behind the woodpile as bullets splintered the cabin wall just above her head. She fired back, not aiming to kill, just to drive them back, to create chaos. The Navajo warriors were a blur of deadly motion, flanking the disorganized settlers with terrifying speed. She saw the young boy who fired first tumble from his saddle, clutching a bloody shoulder. Another settler's horse went down, trapping him underneath. Clay was bellowing orders, but no one was listening. It was a rout. One by one, the settlers who still could turned and fled, whipping their horses into a desperate gallop back toward the safety of the town, their courage left behind in the dust and blood. The silence that fell afterward was shocking. It was broken only by the whimpering of a wounded man and the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. Alice lay still for a long moment, her ears ringing, her heart hammering against the hard-packed earth. Slowly, she pushed herself up. The Navajo leader walked toward her. A shallow cut was bleeding freely from his temple, where a bullet had grazed him. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with that same intense, unreadable gaze. "You fight brave," he said. Alice let out a shaky laugh that turned into a cough. "Ain't brave," she gasped. "Just too stupid to run." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. One of the other warriors called out, gesturing toward the cabin, toward the cellar. Alice's heart twisted. She followed the leader inside, her legs feeling like lead. They opened the trap door. The young Navajo man was awake, leaning against the wall, his face pale and etched with pain, but his eyes were clear. His brother, the leader, knelt beside him, speaking in low, soft tones. Watching them, seeing the wounded man's hand close around his brother's, Alice felt something shift inside her. A line had been crossed. The smoke rising from the bullet holes in her cabin was proof of that. There was no going back to town. She would be a traitor, an outcast, worse than an outcast. But as she looked at the life she had saved, a fierce, stubborn pride burned away the fear. The Navajo leader stood and turned to her. "You have no home here now," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple, undeniable fact. Alice nodded. "Never really did," she said, and it was the truest thing she'd ever spoken. He studied her for a long moment, then gestured with his head toward the wide, empty plains stretching out beyond the valley. "Come," he said, "with us." It wasn't an order. It was an offer, a lifeline. Poker Alice looked around at her little cabin, at the bullet-scarred walls, the broken door, the scattered mess of a life turned upside down. Home was never this place. Home was where you made your stand. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and walked toward him without looking back. As she mounted the spare horse they offered her and rode out with them, the rising sun warming her face, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't running from anything anymore. She was finally riding towards something. The smoke from her burning life was a black smudge in the rearview mirror of her mind. She didn't look back. There was nothing to see but ashes. The warriors rode with a silent, urgent purpose, their horses picking a careful path through the broken country. Poker Alice kept her eyes fixed forward on the back of the tall warrior who rode ahead of her. His name, she'd learned, was Chaitin. He was the leader. The man she'd saved, his younger brother, was named Taza. Taza rode slumped between two other warriors, his face tight with pain, but he was alive. Once he caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was more than enough. Ahead of them, the land broke open into a maze of rocky canyons and dry riverbeds. It was good country for hiding. Chaitin led them into a narrow wash, shielded from view by high stone walls. Here they stopped. Alice slid from her horse, her legs trembling with exhaustion. A grizzled warrior with a long scar down his cheek handed her a water skin without a word. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. She drank deeply, letting it wash the dust and the taste of gunpowder from her throat. Chaitin approached, his arms crossed over his chest. That intense, measuring gaze was back. "You fight settlers," he said. It wasn't a question. He was trying to solve the puzzle of her. Alice wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "I fought fools who were about to get themselves killed," she said, "and get us killed along with them." He grunted, a sound that might have been amusement. "You leave your world," he stated, his voice flat. "Now you have no world." It wasn't cruel, it was just the truth. She was caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. She thought of the pinched, judgmental faces in the town, the whispers that had followed her since she was a girl because her mother was half Mexican. She thought of the loneliness of her little cabin. "That world was never mine," she said, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch into something that resembled a smile. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. His face grew grim. "More will come," he said. "The town will send riders. Then the soldiers will come. They will want blood for the blood that was spilled." He glanced at his brother Taza, then back at her. "They want war." A cold fire lit in Alice's gut. "Then we give them one," she said, her voice hard as stone. But as the warriors began to check their weapons, a new, more immediate threat appeared. Smoke. Not the thin, lazy smoke of their own burned-out cabin, but a thick, dark column rising from the direction of the town. It was too much smoke for a cooking fire. It was the smoke of a building. Or maybe multiple buildings. Chaitin saw it too. His whole body went rigid. "They come," he whispered. But something was wrong. The smoke wasn't moving toward them. And soon, the sound reached them. A distant, frantic ringing. The fire bell from the town. Then a single rider appeared on the ridge. Not a warrior, not a settler, but a boy, whipping his horse into a frenzy, heading straight for them. He was one of Chayton's scouts. He half fell, half jumped from his horse, gasping for breath. He spoke in a torrent of Navajo, his words sharp with panic. Chayton listened, his face turning to a mask of cold fury. He turned to Alice, and the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. "Barton Clay," Chayton said, his voice a low growl. "He did not go back to town. He circled around. He and his men. They have our women, our children." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a hostage situation. Chayton's people had a camp, a hidden village not 2 miles from where they were now. Clay must have known about it. He had bypassed them, ignored them, and gone straight for the heart of the tribe. He wasn't trying to win a fight. He was trying to exterminate them. "He is burning the camp," Chayton said, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it was terrifying. "He holds the others in the old mission church by the river." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The fight at her cabin hadn't been a random skirmish. It was a diversion. Clay had sent that first group of men to pin them down, to draw their fire, while he took his main force and struck at their unprotected families. He had used her act of mercy, to set his trap. The bait hadn't been Taza after all. The bait had been her. There was no time for plans, no time for anything but action. The warriors mounted their horses, their faces transformed into masks of grim, deadly purpose. Alice swung herself into the saddle, her rifle in her hand. This was her fault, her responsibility. She had pulled the trigger on this whole bloody affair. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice tight. Chayton looked at her, his eyes burning like black fire. "We get them back," he said, "or we die with them." They rode like the wind, a storm of vengeance sweeping across the plains. The smoke grew thicker, choking the air with the smell of burning wood and something else, something sickeningly sweet. As they crested a low hill, they saw it. The mission was a small, crumbling adobe church, and it was surrounded. Barton Clay and his men had taken up positions, their rifles trained on the single wooden door. From inside they could hear the terrified cries of children. Clay saw them coming. He laughed, a booming, ugly sound that carried across the field. "Here they come, boys," he bellowed. "Right into the grinder, the chief and his pet white squaw." Chayton raised his hand, and his warriors fanned out, taking cover in the rocks and brush that dotted the landscape. They were outnumbered 2-1, and Clay held all the cards. He had the high ground, the cover of the mission walls, and the hostages. A direct assault would be suicide. It would get every man, woman, and child killed. "We can't attack," Alice said, her mind racing. "He wants us to. He'll kill the children the second we fire a shot." "He will kill them anyway," Chayton said, his voice raw with despair. "He will kill them, and then he will kill us." Alice looked at the mission, at the smug look on Barton Clay's face. He thought he had won. He thought he had them trapped. But he didn't know her. He didn't know the desperate, cornered animal cunning that had kept her alive all these years. Her eyes scanned the terrain, the mission, the river behind it, the steep, crumbling cliff face that rose up from the riverbank. An idea sparked in her mind. A wild, impossible, suicidal idea. "There's another way in," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But you're not going to like it." She pointed toward the river. "The back wall of the church," she explained, her words coming in a rush. "It's old. The adobe is crumbling. There's a small window, high up. For ventilation. It's barred, but the bars will be rusted through." Chayton stared at her. "The cliff," he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "No man can climb that cliff." "I'm not a man," Alice said, a grim smile touching her lips. "And I'm a real good climber." The plan was insane. Chayton would create a diversion, drawing the attention of Clay's men to the front. While they were distracted, Alice would slip down to the river, climb the treacherous cliff face, get through the window, and open the side door to the vestry. It was a slim chance, a 1 in a million shot. If she slipped, if she was seen, if the bars were too strong, it would all be over. Chayton looked at her, then at the mission where the cries of his people were a constant, heartbreaking sound. He saw the determination in her eyes, the steel in her spine. He gave a single sharp nod. "Go," he said. "Be the spirit of the mountain. Be swift. Be silent." Alice didn't waste a second. She slid from her horse and, keeping low, scrambled down into the dry wash that led toward the river. The rocks tore at her hands and clothes, but she didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline was afire in her veins. She reached the riverbank and looked up. The cliff was steeper than she'd thought, a sheer wall of crumbling rock and thorny brush. Above, the sun beat down, making the stone too hot to touch. From the front of the mission, gunfire erupted. Chayton had started his diversion. The sharp cracks of rifles echoed through the valley. Shouts and curses followed. Alice took a deep breath and began to climb. Her fingers bled, her muscles screamed. Twice the rock crumbled beneath her feet, sending her sliding back down, her heart leaping into her throat. But she kept going, driven by the images of the crying children, by the cold fury in Chayton's eyes, by the burning guilt in her own gut. This was her penance. She finally reached the small barred window. It was barely big enough for her to squeeze through. As she'd hoped, the iron bars were old and rusted. She braced her feet, took hold of one, and pulled. It groaned in protest, the sound agonizingly loud. She froze, listening. But the sounds of the firefight out front covered it. She pulled again, harder, putting every ounce of her strength into it. The bar ripped free from the crumbling adobe with a shower of dust and grit. She pulled the second bar free and, heart pounding, wriggled through the narrow opening. She dropped to the floor inside with a soft thud. She was in a small, dark storage room, thick with the smell of dust and old incense. The air was stiflingly hot. Through a crack in the door, she could see them. The women and children of Chayton's tribe, huddled together on the floor, their faces streaked with tears and terror. 2 of Clay's men stood guard over them, their rifles held loosely, their attention focused on the sounds of the battle outside. Alice drew the hunting knife from her belt. Her hands were slick with sweat and blood. She took a slow, silent breath and pushed the door open. The first guard never saw her coming. He was looking toward the front of the church, laughing at some joke his partner had made. Alice drove the knife into his side, a quick, brutal thrust. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and crumpled to the floor without a sound. The second guard spun around, his mouth opening to shout a warning. Alice didn't give him the chance. She launched herself at him, a wildcat fury, knocking his rifle aside. They crashed against the wall, his hands closing around her throat, squeezing the air from her lungs. Black spots danced in front of her eyes. Her hands scrabbled at his face, her nails digging for his eyes. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She brought her knee up hard into his groin. He doubled over, gasping, and she brought the butt of her knife down on the back of his head with all her strength. He went down like a sack of stones. The room was silent, save for the terrified gasps of the women and children. Alice stood over the fallen men, her chest heaving, her vision swimming. An old woman, her face a mask of courage, stood up and came toward her. She placed a trembling hand on Alice's arm. "Spirit woman," she whispered. Alice shook her head, fighting for breath. "Not yet," she gasped. She ran to the heavy wooden bar that held the side door shut. It was thick, heavy oak. It took all her strength, but she managed to lift it from its brackets. With a loud groan, the door swung open. Outside, the firefight was still raging. Chayton and his men were pinned down, taking heavy fire. She looked at the women. "Run!" she hissed. "To the river! Go!" They didn't hesitate. They herded the children out the door and scrambled down the bank toward the safety of the water, moving with a desperate, silent speed. Alice turned back, grabbing one of the fallen guards' rifles. She ran to the front of the church, taking cover behind the thick adobe wall next to the main entrance. She could see Barton Clay reloading his shotgun, a triumphant sneer on his face. He thought he had won. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. Alice took a steadying breath, raised the rifle, and peered around the edge of the doorway. She lined up her shot. It wasn't hate that guided her hand. It was justice. Cold, clean, and final. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. Barton Clay screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, as the bullet shattered his shoulder. He dropped his shotgun, staggering backward, his face a mask of disbelief. His men, seeing their leader fall, faltered. Their confident fusillade turned into sporadic, panicked shots. That was the moment Chayton had been waiting for. He let out a piercing war cry, a sound of pure, unrestrained fury, and led the charge. The warriors rose from their cover like vengeful spirits, firing as they ran, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The settlers, caught completely by surprise, their morale shattered, broke, and ran. They scrambled for their horses, fleeing in every direction, a disorganized mob of terrified men. The battle was over in seconds. Alice stepped out from the church into the sudden, ringing silence. The air was thick with smoke and the coppery smell of blood. Chayton stood over the writhing form of Barton Clay, his face a thundercloud. His warriors were rounding up the few settlers who hadn't managed to escape, their movements efficient and grim. Taza, his leg still wounded but his eyes blazing, came to Alice's side. "You are the spirit of the mountain," he said, his voice filled with awe. Alice just shook her head, too exhausted to speak. The women and children were coming back up from the riverbank, reuniting with their husbands and fathers in a flurry of relieved cries and desperate hugs. In the middle of the chaos, Chayton walked over to her. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching her face. He raised a hand and gently brushed a smudge of dirt and blood from her cheek. "Kiona," he said, his voice soft. "It is our word for the brown hills. Strong, unmoving, a shelter in the storm. This is your name now." Tears welled in Alice's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had no home. She had no people. But in that moment, standing in the aftermath of a bloody battle, surrounded by strangers who now looked at her with respect and gratitude, she felt like she had finally found both. The past was a landscape of ash and smoke, but the future, for the first time in a very long time, felt like solid ground beneath her feet. She looked at the faces around her, at the families holding each other tight, and then at the wide, untamed land stretching out before them. Out here, survival was the only law. And Kiona, the woman who used to be Poker Alice, had earned her place. As the warriors began to tend to their own, she knew her fight was far from over. This victory was just a breath, a moment of peace in a war that was just beginning. The soldiers would come now, and they would come in force. If you enjoyed this story of courage and finding a new beginning, don't forget to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next.